Today, we have a truly insane story about Pitcairn Island. This tiny piece of land has seen it all. Mutineers, Tahitian women, moonshiners, cultists, and many other incredible events that could surpass any adventure novel. But let's go in order. The small Pitcairn Islands are located in the southern Pacific Ocean. It is a small archipelago consisting of 4 islands, but our story will focus on Pitcairn Island, which gave its name to the entire archipelago. It is a very small island, only 5 square kilometers in size. It is covered with volcanic cliffs and steep rocks, as well as dense tropical jungles. This place fully fits the description of a paradise island. The temperature remains around 25 degrees Celsius all year round. Surprisingly, there is plenty of fresh water on the island. The vegetation is lush and grows abundantly. Naturally, such a marvelous place could not go unnoticed. As early as the 11th century, Polynesians settled on Pitcairn. Judging by the evidence, they were likely Tahitians. They established a settlement, brought domestic animals, and lived quite comfortably. Pitcairn has large deposits of obsidian. These first islanders probably thrived by trading obsidian with the inhabitants of Mangareva Island, located 500 kilometers away. They may have even pledged allegiance to the kings of Mangareva. This happy existence lasted for 400 years. Then, the obsidian supplies were depleted, a civil war broke out in Mangareva, and Pitcairn society slowly began to decline. By the time Europeans arrived, the island had been uninhabited for many years. Now, we come to the key event of our story, the voyage of the ship Bounty. It was the year 1787, and Britain launched a very cunning operation. England owned vast colonies in the Caribbean, where they had brought a huge number of enslaved people to work on sugarcane plantations. The problem was that the poor soil of the Caribbean could not sustain such a large population. European crops, such as oats and grains, did not take root on the islands, and the colonies faced the threat of famine, which could eventually lead to food riots. The British then decided that the solution for the West Indies would be the breadfruit tree, whose fruit could serve as a replacement for bread. To collect saplings of this strategically important plant, the British ship Bounty, under the command of Captain William Bligh, was sent on a mission. The ship was to reach Tahiti, where breadfruit trees grew, gather saplings, load them on board, and thus save the colonies from starvation. A few words must be said about Tahiti at the time, otherwise it will be hard to grasp the atmosphere. Upon landing, the English sailors saw a flourishing island, extremely friendly locals, and even more welcoming local women who had rather free-spirited attitudes toward relationships. Tahiti was overflowing with food and rum, which the locals generously offered to the sailors as a sign of respect. And obviously, after the strict customs of England, the gray skies of London, the filth of ports, and the perpetually hungry life of a sailor, this island seemed like paradise to them. When the officers told the crew to gather and board the ship for the return journey, not everyone was eager to leave. Finally, after 24 weeks, having collected 115 breadfruit saplings, on April 5, 1789, Bounty completed its mission and set sail back home, leaving Tahiti behind. However, on April 28th, in the middle of the ocean, a mutiny broke out on board. Its leader was a man named Fletcher Christian, and he was not some rough-looking pirate. He was the ship's second in command, an officer from a wealthy London family who had significant support from the crew. Christian had already had previous conflicts with the captain. Once he accused him of stealing coconuts and nearly brought him to tears. According to Fletcher himself, Bligh even threatened to have him flogged. Moreover, the second in command was practically married to a Tahitian woman, and he was not alone in this. Many sailors wanted to stay on Tahiti. Yes, sailors were the majority, but there were also junior officers. These were often the sons of wealthy aristocrats who were sent on this voyage. Their parents arranged for them to be on the ship so they could gain naval experience and build a successful officer's career. However, it seems that even the sons of rich aristocrats were captivated by the atmosphere of Tahiti. Many were already living with local women, and some had more than one partner. Without these officers, the mutiny would not have been possible. The sailors did not know how to read maps, use navigation instruments, or steer the ship anywhere. But since the junior officers took part in the rebellion, it was successful. The mutineers set Captain Bligh, the officers, and part of the crew who did not support them adrift in a small boat and abandoned them in the ocean. Meanwhile, they turned the Bounty back to Tahiti. However, upon reaching the Paradise Islands, they quickly realized they had acted on impulse. Sooner or later, a punitive expedition would come for them, and they would end up swinging from the yardarm, as was the fate of mutineers in those days. A conflict arose, splitting the mutineers into two groups. One, led by midshipman Peter Heywood, decided to stay on Tahiti. The other, led by the main instigator, Fletcher Christian, who had started the whole mess, boarded the Bounty and chose to escape justice elsewhere. But let's briefly return to the small boat abandoned in the middle of the ocean. Inside were Captain Bligh and his loyal crew members. They were drifting 56 kilometers from the nearest island, Tofua. At first, Bligh headed toward this island, hoping to replenish supplies and water. However, the natives there were extremely hostile. During a clash, one crew member was killed, and Bligh and the others barely escaped by pushing off from the island. Over the next 48 days, the experienced captain led the remnants of his crew to safety. Out of 18 men, he lost only one. In the end, the boat was rescued. Sometime later, Bligh and his sailors made it back to England and reported everything. Bligh, in truth, could hardly be called a lucky captain. He would later endure another disgraceful mutiny, the so-called Rum Rebellion in Australia. However, his fate is a separate story. In England, news of the mutiny spread and a punitive expedition was organized. The Royal Navy dispatched the warship Pandora to the Pacific Ocean. Its mission was to capture the Bounty mutineers and bring them to trial in England. It succeeded in this mission. The 14 mutineers who had remained on Tahiti were arrested on March 23, 1791, and taken back for trial. Of these, 4 were acquitted, while the rest were sentenced to hang. However, at the last moment, the king pardoned 2 of them. One of them was Officer Peter Heywood, one of the key figures in the mutiny. His influential and wealthy relatives had pleaded on his behalf. He would later even become a captain and write one of the most extensive dictionaries of the Tahitian language. But there was a problem. The punitive expedition failed to find the Bounty on Tahiti. The ship, which was their main target, was nowhere to be seen. The locals recounted that before sailing away, the Bounty had been loaded with cows, chickens, goats, and even cats, as well as saplings of useful plants. 9 crew members remained aboard. They took with them 6 Tahitian men, whose status was little different from that of slaves, and 12 Tahitian women. Each European man was given a woman, but the 6 Tahitian men had to share just 3. Realizing that execution awaited them in any colonial port, they set out in search of a new life. And for this purpose, their new captain, Fletcher Christian, chose the small island of Pitcairn. This island had been discovered only 20 years earlier. The ship's log of Captain Philip Carteret, who first sighted it, recorded, "We sighted land to the north. As we approached the island the next day, it appeared as a large rock rising from the sea. And since this land was discovered by a young gentleman, the son of Major Pitcairn of the Marines, we named it Pitcairn Island. Due to the strong surf, we could not land to explore the island. And so, this island seemed like the perfect place to hide." Its position was mapped incorrectly. It was far from shipping routes. The island had no bay where a warship could dock. The only way to reach it was by small boats. However, the island had fresh water. It was green, lush, and had a wonderful climate. The mutineers from Bounty decided to stay. The new settlers appreciated the island for what it was, a true paradise. They found breadfruit trees and planted sweet potatoes and yams, which they had brought with them. The settlers built several houses and divided the land among themselves. Interestingly, the land was quite fertile. However, the English divided it into 9 parts, and the Tahitians did not receive a single piece. It was clear that their discontent was growing. Most likely, back on Tahiti, the sailors had promised them that they would be equal members of the crew. But once they arrived on Pitcairn, the Tahitians were effectively turned into slaves. Their women were taken from them, they were forced to work, and they were not given even the smallest plot of land. To make matters worse, one of the sailors, named McCoy, learned how to distill alcohol from local plants. And so, alongside the already existing tensions, rampant drunkenness was added. Then a very important event took place. During the first year on the island, the Tahitian wives of sailors John Williams and John Adams died. So the Englishmen took 2 women from the Tahitians, who in turn considered them to be their wives. Now the Tahitian men were left with only 1 woman among them. As a result of all these injustices, the Tahitian men conspired to kill the English at night. However, the women betrayed them and told the sailors everything. As a result, 2 of the 6 Tahitians were killed. The remaining 4 were once again enslaved. By September 1793, several children had already been born on the island. The 4 remaining Polynesian men now had only 1 woman among them. According to some sources, her name was Mariva. The English treated them worse and worse, and on October 3, 1793, the Tahitian men staged a rebellion among the mutineers. Their first victim was John Williams. He was followed by Fletcher Christian, John Mills, Isaac Martin, and William Brown. One of the sailors, John Adams, was wounded but managed to survive and hid in the jungle with 3 of his English comrades. And then true madness began. The Tahitian men proved to be no better than the English. Some sources claim that the Tahitian women killed the Tahitian men at night because they turned out to be even more brutal than the English. However, this is not entirely true. The Tahitians simply started killing each other over women and land. Moreover, the 4 Englishmen hiding in the jungle were also not idle and wanted to regain control of the island. Eventually, the Tahitian named Taimuia was shot by the Tahitian Manari over a woman. Then Manari was shot by the sailor William McCoy during a raid. One of the women, possibly Terrara, killed the Tahitian Tataiti, and Edward Young shot the last remaining Tahitian named Neo. And so, Pitcairn Island once again belonged to the English. There were no Polynesians left. On the island, only 4 Englishmen remained: Edward Young, Matthew Quintal, John Adams, and William McCoy. Along with them were 10 women and their children. The next 5 years were relatively peaceful. But then McCoy, who had mastered the art of distilling alcohol from the root of the cordyline terminalis plant, took his production to the next level. As a result, the sailors drank themselves into a frenzy. McCoy tied a stone around his neck and, in a fit of delirium, threw himself off a cliff into the sea. In 1799, a drunken Matthew Quintal, in the midst of alcohol-induced madness, attacked his comrades and was killed by Edward Young and John Adams. A year later, Edward Young, who suffered from asthma, also died, leaving John Adams as the last surviving man on the island. Adams fell into deep despair and sank into a brutal drinking binge. During another bout of delirium, he experienced vivid hallucinations and, apparently, a kind of religious epiphany. The next morning, John Adams destroyed the still and told the women and children that from now on they would live strictly according to the Holy Scriptures. And they did not resist much. In general, the survival of their colony had always depended entirely on the women, as the men were constantly drinking and killing each other. The women had brought some household items with them, and these were passed down from mother to daughter. They cooked their food in traditional Polynesian stone ovens. Their diet consisted mainly of yams, taro, and bananas with coconuts. Occasionally, pork, poultry, or goat meat appeared on the table. At first, they sewed their clothes from the sails of Bounty. Later, they replaced them with loincloths and skirts made of tapa, a traditional Polynesian fabric beaten from the bark of the paper mulberry tree. And for survival, this island was more than a suitable place, if not for its internal tensions. For all these years, the islanders lived in complete isolation. By the way, according to one of the women, around 1797, when a few men were still alive, a ship was spotted near Pitcairn. Sometime later, a second ship appeared, and several sailors came ashore to collect coconuts. At that moment, the islanders hid in the jungle, and the sailors never realized that the island was inhabited. In general, the next 10 years passed relatively well. Adams, who had suddenly turned to religion, tried to build an ideal Christian society on the island. He preached to the women, upheld morality, and fathered children. As a result, most of the modern inhabitants of the island are his descendants. On February 6, 1808, the American whaling ship Topaz arrived at Pitcairn Island and discovered that it was inhabited. Captain Matthew Folger even sent a report about it to England. However, it seems that England was not particularly interested at the time. The country was preoccupied with the Napoleonic Wars, and tiny islands somewhere in the tropics were of little concern. Several years passed. On September 17, 1814, two British ships, Britain and Tagus, which were hunting for the American warship Essex, effectively rediscovered the island and its inhabitants. Upon going ashore, the sailors witnessed a strange scene, something that truly resembled an ideal Christian society. Later, they would compare the island to a lost paradise. These sailors brought news of the island back to England, where it sparked great interest. To understand this, one must consider the social climate of 19th century England. The traditional codes of honor, morality, and social rules that had long been strong in British society were beginning to weaken, and many disapproved of this shift. Just as in modern times, people lamented that life used to be better, while now society was slipping into moral decline. There was a demand for religiosity and for an untouched bastion of morality, something that Pitcairn Island perfectly symbolized. Thus, the island's 25-year isolation came to an end. News of this miraculous island attracted worldwide attention. Ships traveling between India, Australia, South America, and England began stopping there more frequently. Nearly every vessel that approached the island brought generous gifts and exchanged surplus supplies for the provisions produced on Pitcairn. During this period, oranges were introduced to the island, huts were gradually replaced with stone buildings, and clothing and lifestyle became distinctly European. On March 5, 1829, John Adams died at the age of 65. By that time, the island's population had grown to 66 people. Despite his dark past, Adams was mourned as the father of the island. The community had lost its leader. Sometime later, an adventurer named George Nobbs arrived and quickly became the island's new leader. A veteran of the Chilean War, he swiftly consolidated power. However, in October 1832, an even darker figure arrived on the island, Joshua Hill. He claimed to be the governor of Pitcairn, appointed by the British Crown. None of this was true. The con man quickly expelled George Nobbs and anyone who dared to question his authority. He demanded honors and lived like a king on the island. He imposed arbitrary imprisonment and severe punishments for even the smallest infractions, plunging the island into years of tyranny. It wasn't until 1838 that he was exposed. Of course, he had no connection to the British government. The impostor was publicly disgraced and expelled. The period from 1838 to 1848 was a rare time of stability on the island. The population exceeded 100 people. They established their own constitution, traded meat, vegetables, and fruit with passing ships, and lived quite comfortably. Over time, the population surpassed 200. Remarkably, there were almost no outsiders. Nearly all were descendants of the original Bounty mutineers. In 1882, a law was even passed prohibiting foreigners from settling on the island. Later, amendments were made allowing useful individuals to remain. However, to this day, most of the island's residents are descendants of the Bounty mutineers. It seemed like they had everything they needed to live in peace and prosperity. But in 1886, another major shift occurred in the life of the island. A preacher named John Tay arrived, belonging to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and, as you might have guessed, the islanders changed their religion. They stopped eating pork, altered their religious practices, and converted to Seventh-day Adventism. Apparently, John Tay misled the locals by claiming that England had already fully embraced Adventism. He told the Pitcairn Islanders that, as good citizens, they too needed to join the church that had been adopted by the king and queen. To this day, Adventism remains the predominant religion on the island, which at the time still retained its reputation as an isolated haven of morality. This isolation only ended in 1914 with the opening of the Panama Canal. Massive cruise liners carrying thousands of passengers began passing by the island, with many eager to set foot on its shores and witness this remarkable place for themselves. As a result, many members of the community started relocating to neighboring islands in Australia. The island's isolation was over, and one might think that the madness of Pitcairn had been left behind, merely an interesting legend from the past. But no. Now let's fast forward to the present, 2004. By this time, the island's population had dwindled to just 47 people. At its peak, it had around 300 residents, but most had moved to Australia. Then, in 2004, 7 out of the 47 residents were convicted of crimes involving minors. Among them was the mayor of Pitcairn, a man named Steve Christian. As you might have guessed, he was a direct descendant of Fletcher Christian, the leader of the Bounty mutiny. And that seemed to be the end of it. But no, in 2010, another Pitcairn mayor was convicted on similar charges. This means that Pitcairn Island has one of the highest proportions of convicted offenders for such crimes, 8 out of 47 people. Today, the island survives mainly on tourism, and the majority of its population still consists of descendants of the Bounty mutineers. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to give it a like and leave a comment. It would be fascinating to hear your thoughts on this island. Share this video with your friends. They might find it interesting too.